Psalm 47. Clap your hands, all you nations. Shout to God with cries of joy. For the Lord Most High is awesome. The great King over all the earth. He subdued nations under us, peoples under our feet. He chose our inheritance for us, the pride of Jacob, whom he loved. God has ascended amid shouts of joy, the Lord amid the sounding of trumpets. Sing praises to God. Sing praises. Sing praises to our King. Sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth. Sing to him a psalm of praise. God reigns over the nations. God is seated on his holy throne. The nobles of the nations assemble as the people of the God of Abraham. For the kings of all the earth belong to God. He is greatly exalted. This is the word of the Lord.
Well, good morning, church. I'm McDonald, one of the pastors here at Redeemer. And as you just heard, we are looking at Psalm chapter 47 this morning. And you may have read that psalm and felt great about it, or you may have felt a little bit stuck because it's talking about singing, clapping, rejoicing. And it's addressing the nations, sing, clap, rejoice, but it's also saying that God has subdued the nations. That's what it says. It says in verse 1, clap your hands, all you nations. Shout to God with cries of joy, for the Lord Most High is awesome, the great King over all the earth. He subdued nations under us, people under our feet. And that may be confusing to you. That sounds very un-American to say, oh, you subdued us, so now we will rejoice. That's not really the way we roll. So what I want to invite you to is that when you get to a place in Scripture where you have a question like that, wrestle with it. It's your question, but it's also God's question to you. Will you wrestle with this? There's something here to be wrestled with. And so that's what we're going to do this morning, is we're going to ask two questions of Psalm chapter 47. One's going to take a while. The second one won't be quite as long. And that's the first question I want to ask. How can subduing and rejoicing happen together? Okay, so I can think of a time in my life when that was true. So when I was in third grade, I had to move from public school to charter school. And I don't really like having to move from public school to charter school, but one thing I did like was that I had a substitute teacher in elementary school that I really didn't like. Her name was Mrs. Berg, and Mrs. Berg was she was the worst. She was the worst, and she was the worst substitute teacher ever. She's literally in the Guinness Book of World Records. Worst substitute teacher of all time, Mrs. Berg. She wasn't that bad. She was pretty good. She had decades of experience. She brought that to the table. That was good. She knew her subjects pretty well. The only thing with her was that she hated children. That was the one thing that she didn't have that I was like, I wish that wasn't true. So when I moved from the elementary school to the charter school, I was like, great, no Mrs. Berg. But see, I didn't really understand that substitute teaching is kind of a gig. So you can imagine my shock when one day my real teacher said, okay, next week I'm on a trip and you're going to have a woman named Mrs. Berg as your substitute teacher. And I thought, man, it is hard in fourth grade to catch a break. It's really tough. And so we transfer schools. Mrs. Berg, she shows up, and it's Monday. And already she looks disappointed. And I'm like, I didn't even have the chance to disappoint you. How are you so mad at me right now? And there's something that happens when you just see that expression on a substitute teacher's face where the kids look at each other and they go, okay, I guess we're in anarchy now. I guess this place is run by us. And so the whole week was just terrible. And we were not good. She wasn't good either, so it was really her fault. That's what I told my mom, but we were bad. And we had this project that we were doing that week, and it was a conservation project. Everyone was in these little groups, and they had to choose a conservation thing. And so I chose poaching. I was like, I don't know if that's a real thing in Michigan, but I know that's bad, so we'll do poaching. And then the smartest girl in school, Bridget, she chose the oceans, which was a much smarter choice because so we had to come up with a motto, and hers was, please, please, please save our seas. But I could have done that in my sleep. That's easy. I had poachers, so I mean, what rhymes with poachers? Go ahead. You can't think of anything, can you? Nothing does. So I went through all the letters of the alphabet with my friend Justin, and Justin, he was kind of helpful. He was like nerd smart, but he wasn't very street smart. And so I got to the letter V, and I was like, Justin, I think the only thing that rhymes is the word voters. That's the closest I can get. So Mrs. Berg, she just gushed over here about Bridget. So let's do a rhyming thing, and it'll be, hey, poachers, you're bad voters. I'm blushing even telling you now. That was like 30 years ago. This is really bad. So anyway, I did that. I'll own it. I wrote that. And so, so Mrs. Berg, she walks over and she says something that I just will never forget. She looks at our project and she just goes, "You got to be kidding me, right?" And then she just walked away, and I never heard from her again. That was the end of it. So you can imagine how I felt the next week when my real teacher came back. I was pretty bad that week. Mrs. Berg was pretty bad, or Mrs. Berger, as I called her for the rest of the week. And when my real teacher came back on Monday, she subdued us, and I rejoiced. I clapped my hands. Yes, you did it. And if you've ever volunteered with fourth graders, it seems like they desire anarchy, but they don't really like to get away with it. They actually want order. We want order. We want a good ruler. We want a good leader. And so the question isn't really, is it possible for us to rejoice when we're subdued? We all know that experience. The real question is God a good king? Is he someone that we should rejoice in when he says, I have subdued you? And I think Psalm 47 answers that question for us. It shows the goodness of God. Because there's a guy, his name is O. Palmer Robertson, and he wrote a lot of books about the Old Testament, and one book is about the Psalms. And he changed my mind about the Psalms by pointing something out to me, which is that the Psalms are written in books. Did you ever notice that? There's book 1, book 2, book 3. And he just asked the question, why are the Psalms written in books? And he says, well, it's probably for the same reason that all books are written in books. Right? So why are there, how many books are there in Lord of the Rings? 6 is correct. You laughed. 3 is wrong. That was the publisher's mistake. J.R.R. Tolkien wanted to write 6 books because each book and all those 6 books turns the story in a particular direction. The author's telling you, hey, this is going to take a turn. The same thing is true in the Psalms. When does book 2 start in the Psalms? This is sad. You know the 6 books of Lord of the Rings. You don't know when book 2 is in the Psalms. So chapter 42. So we just got into it, right? This is book 2. And so O. Palmer Robertson, he says there's a shift in tone in Psalm chapter 42 because what's been happening is that David is fighting for the throne and he's praying against his enemies. But in Psalm 42, he wins. He has the throne. And here's the way he puts it. He says, the psalmist seems now to have a desire to more directly communicate with the nations. In other words, David gets to the throne, he looks around, all the people who have been trying to kill him, and he says, all right, who wants to be part of this? You all tried to kill me, I got a job for you. That's pretty remarkable. David is turning to his enemies now that he's won victory, and he's saying, do you want to just reconcile? You want to just be part of this? You want to just worship God with me? You're invited. I think it's amazing. It's actually an ideal that we have, that we would be able to do that. Do you know this is the way that the whole political system started out? George Washington, he runs unopposed, but the way that we started out was that you take your political opponent who you're running against for president, and they become part of your cabinet. So John Adams, he's running for the Federalist Party. He's running against Thomas Jefferson, part of the Democratic Republican Party. They're running against each other. They're berating each other and telling the whole world that the other guy's an idiot for a year. And then John Adams becomes president, and who becomes vice president? Thomas Jefferson. You know how long that lasted? 1 presidency. That never happened again. But it was true. You would take your political enemy and make them part of your cabinet, which, you know, a cabinet is a group of advisors, but I have a theory that actually it just used to be a cabinet for the vice president. You just put him in there for 4 years, like, we don't want to hear from you. We'll start over in 4 years. But that's what it was. And that's amazing to think about. I mean, can you imagine the Donald Trump, Kamala Harris presidency? I mean, I can't imagine it. That's why I'm laughing. It's sort of funny to think about. But yeah, right. That's not going to happen. We can't do, it's an ideal that we could never accomplish. We could not do that. And yet David, who, by the way, is Israel's Messiah, that just means the anointed one, the anointed king. David is reflecting God's character and saying, no, I legitimately want to make my enemies part of my kingdom. You're one of my enemies. I've got a job for you. And I just want to think about this characteristic of God that we see in Psalm 47 and the goodness of him as a ruler, because what this means is that God as king, top of his agenda is saying, I'm going to make my enemies my friends. I'm going to make you who are my enemies my friends. And if you are here this morning and you would say, you probably wouldn't say, I hate Jesus, but you might say, I hate the church, or I hate the Bible, or I hate Christianity, or whatever. Jesus looks at you. What do you think he thinks about you? He thinks, oh, you're just the kind of person I want on my team. That's great. You have a lot of hatred for me. I get it. Well, let's reconcile and let's move on. This is Jesus' attitude toward you. It's so incredibly gracious that this is his attitude toward us. In fact, we see this pattern all throughout the scriptures, don't we? This is the gospel itself. Romans chapter 5, verse 10 says, the gospel is that while we were God's enemies, we were reconciled to him through the death of his son. Every single person in this room is a former enemy of God that Jesus has reconciled to himself through himself. That's what God does. We see this in the New Testament too. So Saul, a persecutor of the church, he's going around, he's killing Christians. And at some point, as he is killing Christians, the risen Christ appears to Saul. And this is what it says in Acts chapter 26. And this is Saul recounting it. He says, when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, which is incredible. So this is Saul's childhood language, the Hebrew language. All right, so imagine that you had been a U.S. citizen for 20 years. You immigrated from Mexico. You've been speaking English to everybody for 20 years. And all of a sudden, a man shows up and he speaks to you in Spanish, the language of your abuela. How would you feel about that? It's intimate. It's gentle. And he says, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. All right, so what's a goad? A goad is a spike that you're going to put in back of oxen as they're plowing the fields for you, so that every time they try to rebel against you by kicking you, they get hurt, and that actually spurns them forward to do more of your work. So the more they rebel, the more work you get done. So it's a win-lose, classic win-lose, right? And Jesus is saying to Saul, hey, you're killing all these Christians. They're going to be fine. They're going to be resurrected. Also, by the way, when you kill these Christians, it's just helping the gospel to move forward. So you're kind of doing my work for me. So you want a real job? You want to just come be on my side officially? And Saul drops to his knees. He repents, and he turns from an enemy of God into a friend of God. And this is just what Jesus does. This is what he does in our lives. In fact, I was watching a few weeks ago an old reality show that only lasted for a season about people trying to get a job at Jim Henson's Creature Shop. And it's this reality show where people compete every week to make these puppets, and then whoever makes the best puppet wins. But at the beginning of the show, there's this man and this woman who just have this terrible dynamic. They hate each other. And so, of course, they keep putting them in the same group together, And so after a few episodes, it just kind of got annoying. And I started saying when they got in a fight, I would just say, hey, just kiss each other already. You're supposed to laugh at that. The reason you laughed at that is because... It's because there's something true about this. This is the way romantic comedies work. It's the way romantic comedies work, right? The woman hates the guy because she kind of needs the guy, and she hates that she needs the guy, and he feels the same way about her, and then they kiss at the end. That's how it works. Well, this is Jesus' dynamic with us, right? You hate Jesus because you need Jesus. And Jesus is looking at you and he's like, all right, stop the front. Like, I see all the hatred. I see all the vitriol. You need me. All right, so let's just reconcile. That's what the gospel is. That's Jesus' attitude toward you. I think that's beautiful. So what does that mean for you and for me? If God is in the business, if Jesus is in the business of befriending his enemies, what does that matter for you and for me? Well, I'm going to give you 3 reasons why that matters. Number 1, if it's true that Jesus is in the business of befriending his enemies, this is a little bit of a jump, but it's actually logical. The church will be the most diverse place in the world. It will be. This is the vision that's being pointed to at the end of the psalm. The psalmist says in verse 9, the nobles of the nations assemble. There's plurality. Middle Easterners are still Middle Eastern. Africans are still Africans. Americans are still Americans. The nobles of the nations assemble as the people, one people, the God of Abraham. That's the vision. That's the vision. Many nations, one people. Which means that when we come together on Sunday mornings, we are not coming together because we have the same skin color. We're not coming together because we are part of the same class, because we have the same education, because we all agree on our liberal politics, or we all agree on our conservative politics, or because our kids like each other. We are here together this morning because we were former enemies of Jesus made into friends. Which means that if you work the night shift and you're trying to make ends meet, you might feel like you have more in common with your night shift friends, but you have more in common with somebody who makes 6 figures here at Redeemer because you are both enemies of Jesus made into friends. That's the beauty of the gospel. That is why you can have Matthew, a tax collector, a pawn of the Roman government, in the same group with Peter, who's trying to overthrow the Roman government. And Jesus didn't get them together and said, hey guys, let's work out our differences. He said, hey, you're both enemies of God. I'm going to make you into friends. So you're bonded now forever. That's just the way it works. That's what unites us together. And so the church ought to be the most diverse place in the world. We ought to be the weirdest group of people in Indianapolis. I mean, what the world will say is that diversity is beautiful. And I'm like, well, maybe. I don't think you really believe that, though. Right? I mean, let's get a bunch of Appalachian folks with MAGA hats together with some transgender professors at Butler and put them in a room and let's watch the beauty unfold, right? That's not going to be beautiful. Because it's diversity, but it's not unity. What are you going to unite over? Common values? I don't think so. Some common cause? I don't think so. A person? You're going to become a personality cult? What is going to make that beautiful? It's going to be beautiful if all those same people say, hey, we were enemies of God, but now we're friends of God. The gospel. You're looking for a divine person to unite you. So see, you do want Jesus. That's actually what you're hoping for. That's what you're looking for. You just don't know it yet. And Jesus is saying, stop trying it your way. Just, come on. I can do it. You can't. Secondly, if it's true that Jesus is going about the business of befriending enemies, then nobody is hopeless. You know that? You look around, and we do this with people. We just say, all right, that person's probably likely to become a Christian. That person probably not likely to become a Christian. You know you do this. And when Jesus looks at that person, he says, actually, that's just the kind of person I'm interested in. That's just the kind of person that I like to work with. So you need to keep praying for that person. And you need to keep sharing the gospel with that person because you are planting seeds and Jesus can do literally anything he wants with those things. Do you believe that? You believe that's what Jesus is doing in our city right now is he's taking enemies of his who hate him and turning them into friends. Well, do you believe that's what he did with you? I just heard from somebody who's kind of an online pen pal and they were writing and sharing that, they said a few weeks ago, after not being in church for many, many years, they had read something I wrote and said, I called my employer and I said, I need to take Sundays off so I can go back to church. What is that? That's just Jesus meeting that person where they are and saying, all right, time to come back. I mean, this is years of correspondence. Right? It has nothing to do with me. It has to do with the fact that at some point, Jesus chose to use that to say, all right, I'm going to meet you. And now an enemy is turned into a friend. That is how the gospel works. Jesus turns enemies into friends. And so do you pray for people who seem like enemies and are enemies. This is why, part of my Presbyterian theology, people say Presbyterians, we don't believe in miracles. I totally disagree with that. Actually, I believe salvation is a miracle. I believe I'm looking at 400 miracles right now as I look around the room, because I think it's impossible for you to turn yourself from someone who hates God into someone who loves God. How would you do that? You couldn't turn yourself from somebody who hates cauliflower into someone who loves cauliflower. How could you do that in your relationship to Jesus? It makes no sense. God has to do that for you. He has to do that for you. And so you're a miracle if you love God. That's a total miracle. And that's the business he's going about. Lastly, if God is going about the business of befriending his enemies, we should be doing that too. Now, when you hear enemies, it probably doesn't really map onto your experience. You're like, I don't have enemies. Well, do you have critics? I have critics, especially if you're in some kind of position of authority in your workplace or your neighborhood or whatever. You've got critics. How do you respond to your critics? I think there's an opportunity here to show what Jesus is like and the way you respond to your critics. Actually, one president who pretty successfully roped in his enemies was Abraham Lincoln. So Doris Kearns Goodwin, she has a book called Team of Rivals, and it's all about how there's these three men who are ripping Lincoln's policies apart publicly. And they're actually right about a lot of things, and they're just ripping him up and down. And so Lincoln looks at all their public statements about him, and he comes to each of these three men, and he says, hey, I heard your public criticisms of me. You want a job? And he hires them. They become part of his inner circle. They did some amazing things together. I think there is something about the expansiveness of spirit there that reflects the person of Jesus. How do you respond to your critics? Can you respond by saying, I hear your criticisms, come close to me. Let's work together. I remember a time when I was starting in RUF, our college ministry, and what you figure out pretty soon is that in RUF, you have access on an email list to 180 other campus ministers, which if they had known me, they never would have given me the keys to that car. That's not a good idea to just let me say whatever I want, whenever I want to 180 other pastors. And so there was one particular email chain when someone said something that I just thought was dumb. And so I wrote that, and I wrote why, and I put it in front of everybody. And about an hour later, that campus minister who had 10 years more experience than I had, he wrote me and he said, hey, I get what you're saying. I don't think that was really appropriate. Why don't we get together next time we're at staff training and try to get to know each other? And my heart melted. It's like, oh. And if he had just batted back at me, I just could have kept him in his box. But there's something about the Spirit of Jesus that says, all right, I hear you. You're my critic. Let's team up. Let's do something, right? Let's do something. You have an opportunity to reflect Jesus in your vocation as you do that. Okay, so I have a second question. This one's not going to take as long, but we have to answer it before we close, which is, how does Jesus subdue the nations? How does he do that? It's all kind of up here until we ask, how does Jesus subdue you and me? I do have 35 minutes more of content, but you can ask me about that after. I'm not going to give it to you now. If you want the Peter Jackson edition, this is the sermon I wanted to preach. So I'm going to say some things that I'm not going to be able to support. Okay. So I'm going to give you two answers to this question. How does Jesus subdue you and me? And the first answer we actually see in Psalm chapter 46. See, all these Psalms in the 40s, these are connected together. We know they're connected together because they're all written by the same group of people, the sons of Korah, which this is exegetical speculation, but Sons of Korah, that's the name of their band. That's got to be heavy metal, right? That has to be, I don't know how you do that with a shofar, but it's got to be heavy metal. That's what I think. That's just, again, that's speculation. So the sons of Korah, in chapter 46, verse 6, nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice and they melt. How does Jesus subdue you? Through his voice, through his word. So here's all I'm going to say about that. I'm going to ask you a question. If you were somebody who would say, yeah, I consider Jesus to be my Lord, but you don't consider the Bible or the scriptures to be authoritative, here's my question for you. Can you give me one instance in your life where Jesus, as your Lord, has exercised authority over you without the Bible? How would that work? That doesn't make any sense. You have a mute king. I wish I had a mute boss. I don't have a mute boss. My boss tells me things. I don't really wish I had a mute boss. I mean, sorry, boss, if you're out there. But the point is, like, how would you exercise your authority without a voice? If you do not take the scriptures as authoritative, functionally speaking, Jesus is not your Lord. That just doesn't make sense, all right? So I could support that, but I don't have time. So talk to me after. Second, how does Jesus subdue us? He subdues us through the gospel, okay? So my man, Braden, come on up. Braden has this cool thing called a shofar, which is from Bethlehem. And I was gonna try to blow it, but when I tried, Nick said that it sounded like Braden was calling people to war and I was calling people to the circus. So we're gonna let Braden do it. So there's this cool thing with Psalm chapter 47, where this is used actually every year in the Jewish community, and it's used in the Christian community. And the way it's used in the Jewish community is for Rosh Hashanah. It's the arrival of the new year. It's the celebration of God's presence descending to Mount Sinai. All right? And so the shofar is blown twice, every Rosh Hashanah. And at the beginning, there's a blow called the teruah. And the teruah is kind of a scattered blow that's meant to symbolize the nation of Israel's sin, their worship of the golden calf. Right? The way they've tried to ascend to God unsuccessfully. And after that blow, there's silence. Now, y'all can do silence, I know that. So, you're gonna do that. The second blow is a long, loud blow called the tekiah. And the tekiah is to celebrate that God has ascended to his throne in the temple graciously, despite Israel's sin. And so it's a long, loud blow. And when that second sound is made, you're going to clap and cheer, all right? Now, Presbyterians, if you're instructed to do so, you will clap. So that's what I've learned about you. So second blow, clap. First blow, silence. Repentance and ascendance. All right. Why would we cheer for God on the throne? Good job, by the way. Good cheer. Why? Why is that good news? Well, in the Christian tradition, we read this psalm every year on Ascension Sunday. It's the Sunday when we celebrate Jesus rising from the dead and going to sit at the right hand of his heavenly Father. And you might think, wait, the Jewish tradition is about God descending. The Christian tradition is about Jesus ascending. How do those things relate? Well, according to the author of Ephesians, it makes total sense. Because how do you have a Jesus who ascends if he doesn't first descend? That's what Ephesians chapter 4 says. In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he had also descended into the lower regions, the earth? He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens that he might fill all things. He's saying Jesus is the fulfillment of Rosh Hashanah. He is the fulfillment of the Jewish people's celebration. He is the fulfillment of Sinai. Because he not only ascended to the throne, he descended to be with his people. So a few weeks ago, I gained up the courage to watch the movie Schindler's List. And it's a very hard film to watch, but it's a true story. It's a story about a German man named Oskar Schindler, and he's made a lot of money off of World War II because he's found that he can employ Jewish people for very cheap and just make loads and loads of money. But about halfway through the film, he discovers that he is actually saving these people by employing them, They're mandatory workers, and so they're not going to be sent off to the gas chambers. And so it's sort of this anti-hero movie where he's wrestling with, well, I could make more money, or I could spend all my money bribing other Germans to let me have these people. And so it's interesting, the ending of the film, it doesn't end how I thought it would. Schindler stands up in front of these thousands of people that he's rescued from the gas chambers, and he says, I am not a hero. A real hero would have been one of you. I could never be one of you. I could never face the things that you're facing. I didn't give you everything I have. I've got a lot. I'm not a hero. So go live your life, but don't think of me as your hero. But Jesus did do those things. Jesus was one of you. Jesus descended. He suffered what you suffer. He went to the cross and took on your shame, your guilt, your scorn, your envy of him. And he spread out his arms and he said, I subdue myself to you as Lord and King of the universe. Now, when I ascend, would you subdue yourself to me? And that's why we cheer for Jesus' ascension. And see, my real teacher, she remembered what it was like to be a child. Mrs. Berg, she forgot. Jesus remembers what it's like. And that's why it's good news that Jesus ascends to the throne. And that's how he makes his enemies into his friends, through the gospel. Jesus, we thank you for your goodness to us. You are king. We're glad that you're king. We clap, we sing that you're king, because there's no one like you. There's no ruler on this earth who could possibly rule the kind of kingdom that you are ruling now and will rule in the future. And so we come before your table, your heavenly feast, and we rejoice with you. In Jesus' name, amen.